This screencast will get us started with Unit 3, with the American Revolution and Founding Documents. This unit will carry us through the rest of the semester to end Semester 1. The screencast in particular will cover colonialism, and you should use the guided note sheet, either a hard copy or digital, in order to collect notes from this screencast. So this is what the guided notes sheet looks like that you can find on Canvas or have a hard copy. As you go through the screencast, be sure to collect notes at each point under the Roman numerals. The guiding questions and topics are there for you under each Roman numeral to help you focus on the specific content that you'll need to gather from the screencast. So as we continue on, we'll take a look at Roman numeral 1, American Colonies Settlement. So the first thing I think we need to go back and take a look at as we're beginning our unit of study on the American Revolution and Founding Documents in looking at colonialism is to figure out why the English even settled in America. Well, this is at a time period in the 14, 15, and 1600s where a lot of European colonies were expanding and exploring in different areas of the world, including countries like Portugal, Spain, and France, along with Great Britain or England. So looking at England in America in particular, usually we use the 3 G's for American colonial settlement, and you'll see them right here: God, gold, and glory. So you can use those 3 G's there for why the English settled in America. Religious freedom, of course, with possible wealth and the availability of land and even adventure. The British government in particular encouraged colonialism and settlement throughout the world because of their policy of that big bold word there, mercantilism. Mercantilism, by definition, is an economic policy that means a country's power is determined by its wealth. So if you're looking at kind of like an equation, power equals money. So to get more power, they need more money. And in order to do that, nations would set up colonies all over the world to export products from. So they would collect the raw materials and then they would sell them to other countries in the world. And America, those colonies there that we settled, those 13 colonies, were a prime target. Once the settlers, of course, got to America, they faced a lot of challenges, including clearing the land and the weather and disease, starvation. You probably have heard the story of the lost colony in North Carolina. Of course, there were other people here, Native Americans, with whom sometimes we had conflict. Strangely, though, most of the time we did not have conflict with Native Americans. Just the reason that a lot of people think that we always had problems with Native Americans is because of some of the huge clashes that we learn about in history. But we had conflicts with Native Americans and then also fighting other countries like France and Spain over territory, one in particular becomes integral to understanding the causes of the American Revolution. So part of your notes for Roman numeral 1 includes listing the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. So I have those listed there. You might even have to pause the screencast. But to take a look, there are 4 New England colonies: Massachusetts, which was actually including today's Maine, and then Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Then in blue you have New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And the southern colonies of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Be sure that you get those written down on your notes. So now we're going to take a look at politics and economics in particular of the colonies, and that becomes important for our study of the American Revolution and the United States Constitution, of course. So we'll tackle colonial politics in Roman numeral 2, and I want us to take a look at Jamestown and the Mayflower Compact. Those are really the 2 main colonial settlements that we focus on in civics. Now, in U.S. history, you focus on a lot of different things there with colonial politics and economics and even society. But for us in civics, we need to understand that the first permanent English colony was Jamestown in Virginia, which was settled in 1607. And I want you to understand that we've already discussed representative democracy and types of government. Jamestown actually establishes the first representative democracy in the United States. So this sets a precedent for the kind of government that colonists set up and that colonists believe in. And remember that a representative democracy means that you elect people, right, there's a definition, to represent citizens in government. And we have the representative democracy in Virginia with the Virginia House of Burgesses. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the colonial representation for those Jamestown colonists. Of course, we start out with white male property owners being those that can actually participate in government in colonial America. But we also have the Mayflower Compact, and if you remember the Mayflower, as we are approaching Thanksgiving, of course, at the end of November, we study Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. On the Mayflower, of course, the Pilgrims, and some of them were Puritan by religion, they settled in Massachusetts in 1620. Now, Puritans in particular were leaving England because they were being persecuted. You have to understand a little bit about English history to understand why the Puritans were leaving, but not to go into too much detail. The Puritans wanted to purify, that's where they get their name, to purify their beliefs of any Catholic rituals at all. And that's what the Anglican religion was in England. The Anglicans were mainly Protestant after the Protestant Reformation. Protestant where they believed that you only need salvation through Christ to get to heaven in their beliefs. But they also had a lot of Catholic rituals built in Anglicanism. And Anglicanism was created by Elizabeth, which was, of course, one of Henry VIII's daughter. And if you remember, again, backing up just a little bit further, Henry VIII had all of those wives that he had, some of them he had killed, in order to continue looking for a male heir. And he broke with the Catholic Church and created the Church of England in order to do just that, because you weren't supposed to get divorced in the Catholic belief then, the Catholic faith. So he created the Church of England, which was later actually created to be Anglican, which again, Protestant beliefs and Catholic rituals by Queen Elizabeth, his daughter. And then the Puritans were a separate sect of religious people who wanted to purify their beliefs of any Catholic rituals whatsoever. And they were being persecuted because they were oftentimes in the minority, so they came to America to look for, again, as we said before, one of the reasons colonists came to America, for religious freedom. They all signed the Mayflower Compact, and a compact is just a fancy word for a contract, which said that they would agree to follow the established government in the colony. They would all do that together. Well, this is actually what we call a direct democracy, and it's the first written framework of self-government in the colonies. And that is incredibly significant, which is why it's in all capital letters, bolded and underlined. Two reasons why the Mayflower Compact is significant. It's the first written framework of self-government in the colonies, where we create our own government as colonists, and also because it's a direct democracy, where all the people are going to agree on this issue. So here in the early 1600s, we have the first framework for our foundations of government beliefs anyway, with the colonists. In Jamestown, it's representative democracy. In Massachusetts, with the Mayflower Compact, it's direct democracy and provides our first written framework of self-government. And just to give you kind of an idea of where Jamestown and the Mayflower Compact, of course, was created, here's the colony of Virginia. And you'll see that here at Jamestown in Virginia, right here, where Massachusetts is further north here, to the north, a little bit to the east. And then the Massachusetts Bay Settlement with Plymouth and the Mayflower Compact being here in this area, with Virginia further to the south. And of course, this also is part of Massachusetts as well, which is today's Maine. So now we're going to focus on Roman numeral 3 with colonial economics, and we're going to focus again, of course, you'll see there the word on the screen, mercantilism. The British used those American colonies in order to extract wealth from them, so that wealth would equal more power. And the more power you had, the better off you were as a country in Europe. As a matter of fact, the phrase is, the sun never sets on the British Empire. So when Great Britain was an empire, they owned either their own country or a colony on every continent except Antarctica. They had expanded all over the world. In America in particular, the wealth of the colonies were impacted, as you'll see there, by their geography and their climate. And that breaks us down into three different, really, regions of colonies: New England, Middle, and the Southern colonies. And the New England colonies and Middle colonies were quite similar in the fact that they had some farming and some fishing. They mainly focused on shipbuilding. In New England, it was a little different because they were the first to really expound with manufactured goods, where the middle colonies continued on with mainly their fishing and their shipbuilding because of the Bay Area had good harbors in order for them to build ships, and the same is true with New England. In the southern colonies, the harbors weren't so great for shipbuilding, so a lot of times they had some difficulties exporting their products by ship, and sometimes would have to move them up north, of course, in order for them to be exported. But they still were able to export some, particularly at Charleston in the south and also New Orleans in the south, and those are probably our best harbors here in the south. But of course with the southern colonies, with geography and climate, where it was rather harsh in New England, and New England had also kind of rocky terrain, in the south there was good climate for growing crops, longer growing season, and also good soil for growing. And that's where you have the rise of cash crops, and there, of course, plantation slavery. And I want to clarify that it's not just slaves in the South, but slaves were everywhere in colonial North America, including New England and the middle colonies. But the institution that developed in the southern colonies was specifically plantation slavery, where you used these slaves in sometimes large numbers, even upwards to 100 to 200 slaves, although they weren't very frequent. Most people who owned slaves in the South had anywhere from like 5 to maybe even 20 slaves. Still a good number of slaves and slavery, and it becomes actually an institution and ingrained in the South. And the New England and middle colonies, eventually that kind of wanes away because of the fact that you have manufacturing and not so much manual labor, but the fact that slaves still existed in New England and the middle colonies is something to point out as well. And in the southern colonies, that plantation slavery was made I guess easier to become an institution because of the triangle trade. And you probably heard of the triangle trade route before, and that's where there literally does form a triangle between 3 continents of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And trade of goods occur between these 3 continents. And that, of course, helped to propel this institution of slavery, plantation slavery, in the South, and allowed for slaves also to exist in the northern and middle colonies. So from Europe, what would happen is these large ships or slavers would be loaded with manufactured goods, rum, and guns, and other products too, but those are just 3 of the main ones, and they were taken to Africa, where they were exchanged or sold, basically, for slaves. And these slave ships, same slave ships, would be packed with slaves, and they were taken to the Americas. And this was what was called the Middle Passage right here, because that was the middle leg of the journey for the slave ships. And then from the Americas back to Europe, of course, the slaves would be deposited not only in North America, but also South America. And the products that they produced, molasses, cotton, rice, and tobacco, were packed, of course, on these same ships and then taken over to Europe, where the process would start all over again. And so it was unfortunately rather profitable in terms of looking at this source of free manual labor, and it was utilized in the South in plantation slavery. But all the colonies, of course, and these continents are going to benefit from that in some way. Even those stronger empires in Africa that actually eventually go to war in order to gather slaves in order to maintain this triangle trade. And this is just a map that kind of also demonstrates triangle trade, and the darker mustardy yellow brownish looking color is supposed to be the ocean, and here's Europe. And so your manufactured goods are coming into the west coast on Africa. Then the slaves are being transported from the west coast over to South America and to North America. Actually, a lot of North American slaves actually came in from the Caribbean. So they weren't actually directly imported from Africa, which means that they actually had some, I guess you could say, unfortunately, experience with growing these plantation crops, where again they would be transported back to Europe and sold. And there was a huge demand in Europe for those plantation products. And of course, as the 1700s continue with plantation slavery, cotton becomes king. And that's really kind of what you'll learn about in U.S. history, how cotton becomes king in the American colonies. And eventually, of course, the United States wants to become independent from Great Britain, so that by 1791, when you have the Eli Whitney's cotton gin being invented, it makes cotton production even quicker. The demand goes up, and then, of course, you have these huge cotton plantations throughout the South in order to make these southern plantation owners and economists very wealthy and productive. And also the northern colonies, New England colonies, benefit from that with the manufactured good of cotton cloth. So this is going to end our first part of the screencast, and we'll move on to religion and other ideas of the colonies next.